In today's tutorial, we're going to answer the question that Spring developers continue to ask, and that is, why is constructor injection the recommended approach to dependency injection? To do that, we're going to go back to some of the basics and talk about different things like spring beans and application context, dependency injection, and inversion of control. What's up, friends? My name is Dan Vega, and I am a Spring developer advocate. If you'd like to see more tutorials like this one, do me a big favor, help me out, hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel. These things really help me out and help get this channel in front of more viewers. With that out of the way, let's jump on into today's tutorial. The first thing that we're going to do today is create a new Spring Boot project. And to do so, we're going to head over to our favorite website, start.spring.io. Just to show you a little feature of the browser, there is this blue little star here. That means I have favorited it, I have bookmarked it, because I am going to come back here often. So you should do the same as well. So today we're creating a new project. It's kind of like TikTok, but we're going to call it Spring Talk. And it's just going to be full of Spring videos. I'm actually going to give you that one for free. Go ahead and run with that if you'd like. So this is going to be a Maven project. We're going to use Java. The latest release of Spring Boot is 2.6.4. So we're going to go ahead and use that. I'm going to type in a group of dev.danvega. The artifact is Spring Talk. And we can leave those the same way. We want to choose Java 17. We're going to go ahead and add a dependency of Spring Web. That's really all we need today. And we're going to go ahead and generate that project. I'm going to go ahead and open up my terminal. I'm in the downloads folder. I'm going to go ahead and unzip the Spring Talk project. And I'm going to use IntelliJ to go ahead and open this up by pointing to the pom.xml. All right, so the first thing I'd like to do is just go ahead and open up my application. I'm going to go ahead and run this just to make sure everything is working as expected, and it is, so I'll go ahead and stop that. So for our Spring Talk application, we're gonna need a couple of classes. We're gonna start here in our project, and we're gonna go ahead and create a new package. I'm gonna call this a controller package. In the controller package, I'm gonna create a new class called video controller. So this controller class is ultimately gonna be a controller class that is able to accept requests and return responses. So we're gonna go ahead and create that. I'm also going to hop back over here, and I'm gonna create a new package called repository, if I can spell. And in the repository, we're going to create a new repository called video repository. And that is also going to be a class. So we have two classes there. I'm going to jump back to the main application. And I want to talk about just how we might interact with these classes in a non-Spring application way, right? So I might want to create an instance of a controller at some point. So I might say var controller is equal to new video controller, and that would create me an instance. But in that video controller, what if I needed a dependency? What if this controller was dependent on another class? Because a controller in an MVC world is really just a thin controller. It should be dumb. It should just accept requests and return response. It shouldn't do business logic. So we're going to delegate that off to the video repository. So I might come in here and I might create a private final video repository. We'll call this repository. IntelliJ is going to help us out here and create a going to help us by creating a constructor here. So again, we're not in the Spring world yet. We just have a regular class that has a constructor that takes in a parameter of video repository type. So if we go back to our application, now this is complaining, saying, hey, I need a repository here. What are you doing? Can you get me a repository? So then you would probably create a repository, and this is equal to a new video repository. And now that is satisfied, right? So now we can go ahead in our video controller and just create a regular method. This may return a string. We may get the next video. So let's go ahead and return next video. And that's all there is to it. And here in our application, we can now say controller.next. And so that's going to return something, right? So we can introduce a local variable. We'll call this response, and then we can go ahead and output this. So this is kind of the progression, again, without Spring being involved, right? We're just going to go ahead and run this application. It should go ahead and output our next video, which it does, and everything is good to go there. So this is our basic application without Spring. We haven't told Spring about these classes that we have created, this video controller and this video repository. We haven't told Spring about them. They don't know anything about them yet. And so you can see that just in this simple context, it's going to get very hard to keep track of these dependencies. So video controller is dependent on video repository. Video repository may be dependent on something else. And this is the kind of situation that you get in where classes need to be instantiated. Classes also may have dependencies on other classes. And so this is where Spring really helps us out. But before we dive into a few more things, let's go ahead and talk about some of these terms that we're going to come across. The first question I want to answer is, what is a Spring bean? So a bean is just a fancy word for an object. When you create a new instance of the video controller, you're creating an instance of an object, a Java object to be exact. A Spring bean is just a bean that Spring manages for you. As you will see throughout this tutorial, there's a way to instruct Spring that this particular object, I want you to go ahead and manage it for me. So those are Spring beans. The next question I want to answer is, what is an application context? So we just learned about Spring beans. Once these beans are created, we need something to manage this. And that is exactly what it's there to do. It's there to instantiate, configure, and assemble all of these beans together. So the application context has this big pool of beans, and then we can get access to it. And we'll see an example of that later. So just think of the application context as the IOC container. We'll get to IOC in a second, but the container of all the Spring beans in your application. The last term I want to cover is, what is dependency injection? So we just saw in a previous example that we declared a dependency in our video controller. The video controller is its own class, but for it to work, it depends on the video repository. So that video repository is a dependency in the video controller. So whenever you have a dependency, you need to get an instance of that dependency into that class. And so this really comes in and really starts to define what dependency injection is. You don't want to have to manage all of these dependencies. We need to get a dependency in there. So how can we handle that? And that's where inversion of control, or IOC, comes in. And all that does is say, let's inverse this. Instead of us having to manage those dependencies and get them into the classes, we're gonna put that responsibility on the framework. So dependency injection is a way to get an instance of that object, that required dependency, into a class. IOC is saying, let's not do that ourselves. Let's flip that, let's inverse that, and put that responsibility on the framework. All right, now that we understand some of the basic terms that we're going to be using as we kind of walk through this, let's go ahead and get rid of this. And I want to take a look at this Spring application.run. If we go ahead and introduce a local variable here, let's just go ahead and call this app. We'll notice that what we get returned back from this is a configurable application context. So remember, we have an application context. This is the container. This is what is managing the instantiation, the configuration, the dependency injection of all of the classes that we ask Spring to care about. And if we look at this, this is just an application context. You could see that it extends application context. This is, of course, an interface as well. But what that means is, now that we understand that this is a container that holds all of the beans, we can actually take a look at what all the beans are that it's managing for us. So if we go ahead and say, let's go ahead and say app.get bean definition names. So this is actually going to return an array. Let's go ahead and stream that. So we're going to turn that into a stream. And the reason we're going to do that is just so we can say for each And we can use a method reference here to go ahead and print out each of those bean definition names. So if we go ahead and run this, we're going to see a whole bunch of names printed out here. And these are all the beans that the application context is managing for us. I'm not going to do it, but if we were going to, kind of scroll through here and look at every single one of these, we're actually not going to find video controller or video repository. So I can even search here. I could say video, and actually it would start with a lowercase, so I could say video controller. That's not there. The only class that is part of the things that we wrote right now is going to be the Spring Talk application. There's going to be a bunch of those because that's the name of it, but eventually we'll get down to the bean, and there is the bean. This is the bean. Remember, a bean is just a class. It's just a object that Spring is managing for us. And in fact, it is managing the main class in our application for us, and that is a bean called Spring Talk application. So it is taking the name of the class and starting with a lowercase, using camel case as the way to identify that particular bean. So that is a way to print out basically every bean that is being contained or being managed for us. And then this is the only one that's being managed for us right now. Question becomes, how do we tell Spring that we want you, Spring, to go ahead and manage some of these classes for us? So let's go ahead and minimize this. I'm going to go ahead and get, actually, we're going to keep that there just for a second. So I'm going to come into Video Controller, and the way that we tell Spring that we want you to go ahead and manage this for us is by using one of these special annotations. So you've probably seen something like component. In this case, it's a controller, so we're going to use REST controller. REST controller is actually just a component or annotation that is made up of other annotations like controller, like response body. And if you look at controller, controller is a component. So at the heart of it all, a component is what indicates that this class is a component. And these classes are considered as candidates for auto detection. So when Spring is looking through your application, trying to find things to manage, this is going to tell Spring, hey, this is one of those things that I would like you to manage. So by annotating this with @REST controller, we've said to Spring, hey, I want you to go ahead and manage this for us. Also, we're going to be getting some red here because I'll explain that in a minute. But video repository, again, this is another class that we want to tell Spring to manage. Again, we can come up and say component. There's actually a specialized version of this called repository. So we're going to use repository. And now Spring is going to manage these two classes for us. So if we come back to our application, let's go ahead and run this again. And at this time, we should see our two classes that we just annotated somewhere up here. And here they are, video controller and video repository. So now our classes are being managed by the Spring IOC container, the application context. So that's the first part. Now, that was one way to say, hey, go ahead and manage this for me. Another way is by using an annotation called @bean. And @bean is a method level annotation, while the other ones, component, controller, REST controller, repository, those are all class level annotations. So you might need a bean if you have a method that is going to return a Java object for you. So in this case, there's a special command, there's a special interface in Spring Boot. I'm just using this as an example so you can see a bean created. But there's a special type called a command line runner. And if we go ahead and create an instance of this command line runner, if we go ahead and look at this, this is a functional interface. So it has a single method in here. So this is a candidate for a Lambda. So we can just say return and args, whoops. And this will go ahead and return something like hello world. Let's just say hello from the command line runner. And then that is all we need. So this bean is now going to tell Spring, hey, what is returned from here? This is going to be of type command line runner. And I want you to go ahead and manage this one for me too. So let's go ahead and stop and run this. We're going to see a couple things here. One is right here is the hello from our command line runner. And then you could see there's a type here of command line runner. So again, we have instructed Spring by using an annotation that this is something I need you to manage for me. I don't want to manage these things. And so now that we understand how to instruct Spring how to manage these things, let's talk about dependency injection. So we're back in our video controller. I'm actually going to remove this constructor so we can just go ahead and talk about this. So this video controller is dependent on another class. That class is the video repository, meaning that we need that class to perform the functions that we need to in the controller. So for an example, we might have an endpoint that says, get me all the videos, right? The video repository class is going to be responsible for returning a list of all the videos. And so we can't function as a controller without that. So we are dependent on that particular class. So when we talk about dependency injection, we don't want to create a constructor. So we can come in here and create a constructor. We don't want to take anything in. I just want to show this as an example. We could say this .repository is equal to new, come on Dan, video repository. And there we go. Now we have an instance, right? This is a good thing, but this is not a good thing because now we are managing that class on our own. What if video repository had dependencies? Then we need to make sure we satisfy those dependencies. And it gets into this whole graph of classes that we don't want to have to manage. So remember, we have asked Spring to manage this for us. So let's let Spring do that. By doing this, you are not letting Spring do its job. You have kind of taken over the control of that. We want the inverse of that, right? Inversion of control. We want to put that control on the framework, not us. So anytime you see yourself doing new object, in Spring, you're probably there's probably a better way to do it. So let's talk about that. So there are three main ways that we can get a dependency into a class. One is through constructor injection. Two is through setter injection. And three is through field injection. And let's just talk about how each of these work. So the first one and the recommended one is constructor injection. We'll talk more about why this is the recommended approach, but here we have declared a private final video repository. What we are saying with final is that this is going to be an immutable type. We do not want to modify this after we have created it. So this is a great approach. You can see that here in IntelliJ, and they're going to help us out, and you can go ahead and get some actions here. One of those is to add a constructor parameter, and now we get this nice constructor parameter. What's going on here, and you can see this in the gutter here, is Spring is going to auto wire in this video repository for us. So that's another term you're going to hear a lot is auto wire. And this, what you're seeing here, is actually an implicit version of using this @AutoWired annotation. This annotation tells Spring, hey, I need you to auto-wire in this dependency for me. The reason this was implicit is because since Spring 4.3, I think-ish, somewhere around there, this became redundant. If there is a single constructor in your class, which there is here when they have one constructor, Spring is smart enough to look at that and go, okay, you have a dependency there that I actually manage. I can give you that. You don't need to tell me to auto-wire it in. I'm going to assume you need that. So without that, that is the same thing. And you can see by this gutter icon here in IntelliJ that it's telling us that Spring has managed that for us. It's going to wire it in for us. So that is the first, which is constructor injection. Through setter injection, so we can create a method in here that is a setter. So this would be something like public void. We're not going to return anything. We're going to set the video repository. And the way that we're going to do this is by using that @AutoWired annotation. So this is saying we cannot make this final. So this is the first kind of drawback to using the setter injection, is we can no longer make this final, right? Because a final, an immutable object, says that we have to go ahead and create it when we instantiate this particular class. So we need to do that through the constructor. There's getters involved, but there should be no setter for something, because then it can be modified later and we don't want that. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and remove that final. And this should go ahead and work out now. So now we've satisfied that dependency. So the third way is to just go ahead and add the @AutoWired annotation here above our video repository. And this is number 3, field injection. We are injecting the instance of this video repository right on to this field. So this is the one that comes up the most, is, controversial. People kind of talk back and forth on when you should use this and when you shouldn't. Again, IntelliJ is already starting to tell us here, hey, that field injection is not recommended. It's not a great approach. And so let's talk through a couple reasons why. So the way that this works is, first off, we're violating Java, right? Java, in just the Java sense, we have a property, we have a field here in video controller that is of type private. And it's private, yet somehow Spring is able to go ahead and give us an instance of that class to kind of set that field, right? And that's not what we want. We've declared this is private. Anybody outside of here should not be able to go ahead and set that. And the way that Spring is able to do that is through reflection. And so, that's fine. It works. But again, that can get kind of messy if you're trying to do that yourself. So that's the first thing. It's private, and Spring has kind of bypassed the conventions of Java, right? The next thing is, you notice that we can't make this final. So if I come in here and I say final, it's going to complain, because again, this is happening after the instance of this controller has been created. So that leads to something else, which is there's a chance that this could be null. We may start to do something and realize that video repository is null. And that's because, again, this controller is being constructed for us, and after the fact, Spring is using reflection to go ahead and have that instance of the video repository on that field for you. So those are a couple things. The other thing is testability, right? This becomes harder to test. So in a controller, if I wanted to create just an instance of my controller, if I was doing this, how would I do this? The only way that you could do this using this @AutoWired here is you would have to use reflection to get this value in here. And again, that becomes, you don't want to be messing with reflection. Even if you know it, I've done enough reflection in my days. I still got to go look up the syntax every single time. So that becomes, a pain in the butt to do as well. So really, there is no reason to use field injection. The one thing I hear from everyone, and this is always the matter of the fact, is that this is cleaner and this is much less code. Well, it's not much less code, right? Like you're gonna probably have a constructor anyway. So go ahead and just set those arguments, create those as arguments to the constructor, and now you have constructor injection. And the other argument is, well, what if I have like 10 or 12 or 13 dependencies? Then I have this really long, messy constructor. That sure is a problem, but that speaks more volume to me to the way that you've designed or architected your application to have that many dependencies on a particular class. Here in the constructor, you should have or here in the controller, I don't see a reason to have more than a few more. 3 to 5 arguments. If you have 10 to 15 arguments in a constructor to do what you need to do in this class, there's probably a better way that you can abstract that, business logic to somewhere else. So those are just things to think of. Now, the only time where it is okay to use field injection is within a test. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. Let's do this and let's make this final. And let's go ahead and have IntelliJ help us. Now we're back to using Constructor Injection for the win. All right, so we're going to generate a test, and this is going to be a video controller test, and we're just going to say okay. And this is going to be a at Spring Boot test. And let's say that I needed a instance of that controller. So I'm going to say private video controller. And we'll just call this controller. Now to get an instance in here, we don't have a constructor in our JUnit test here. We have some methods that we could use, like, before and after, but in this instance, because we don't have constructor injection available to us, it is okay in this instance to go, let's go ahead and auto wire this in. So we're using field level injection here. And in this case, in a test, it's okay because of all the things we talked about. One of the things in the controller was testability. Well, we're in a test, so that doesn't matter as much. Now, video controller actually has a dependency, right? Remember, it has a video repository. So we have a video repository. We'll call that repository. And what we're going to do with that, though, in this case, is we're not auto wiring in an instance of that. We are solely focused on testing the video controller here. So what we're going to do is just mock out that particular bean by using that mock bean annotation. And now if we go ahead and write a test, so let's write a test to make sure everything is just working. You'll see this a lot. Context loads. We just want to make sure that everything we're doing here is okay. So let's go ahead and assert not null for the controller. And let's do the same for the repository. Whoops. And let's go ahead and run these tests, which is just one of them. And green means go. Good. So everything is set up here. We are looking good. So that is the one instance where it is okay to go ahead and use field injection. All right, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on constructor injection in Spring Boot. This was a good kind of back to basics lesson on everything around dependency injection. I hope you learned a lot. I had a lot of fun putting this together. And again, this is a really good video to just kind of reference. I get this a lot. I get why is constructor injection the recommended approach. So I hope you learned something. If there are things that are missing from this, this was really just kind of an introduction. If you want to deep dive on this, if there's anything else you'd like to see, please go ahead and leave me a comment below. And I think that's where we'll end it today. I really appreciate it. If you found value in this video, please go ahead and hit that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, friends, happy coding.